All right, so we got some really interesting stuff to dig into today.
Yeah, definitely.
These excerpts you sent over from the Echoes of Russia podcast,
Yeah,
it's a lot to cover, but that's what we're here for, right?
exactly. It's going to be a deep dive for sure.
Our mission today is to sort of like pick out the really big takeaways from this overview of Russian history.
1,000 years.
I know, all the way from the very beginning to the present day. As of when this podcast was released, which was 2025.
Yep, 2025, yep.
Okay, so that gives us a kind of an end point to aim for.
Definitely.
Now, what I found striking, just skimming through this material, is just how much ground it covers.
I know, right? You've got Kievan Rus, the Mongol invasions, the rise of Moscow.
The Tsars.
Yeah, the entire Tsarist era, the whole Russian Empire.
The revolution.
The Soviet Union.
And then modern Russia as we know it today.
It's a lot.
It's mind-boggling. And we're talking about empires rising and falling, revolutions. Or transformation. Yeah. I mean, just trying to wrap my head around all that in one go is a challenge.
It's a lot to process.
It is, but that's what makes it so fascinating.
Right.
So let's start right at the beginning with Kievan Rus. Where does that name even come from?
Well, the Echoes of Russia podcast points to the 9th century.
Okay.
Is the starting point, and it involves these Viking traders.
Vikings in Russia. That's not something you hear every day.
Right. But they were known as the Rus. And they didn't just conquer. They sort of merged with the existing Slavic tribes that were living in the area.
So it was kind of a fusion of cultures from the very start.
Exactly. And that led to the formation of Kievan Rus.
Centered around what's now the city of Kiev?
Exactly. It wasn't like a tightly controlled empire, though, more like a loose federation of principalities.
Okay, so a lot of different groups with some shared connections. Now, the podcast really emphasizes this one event that seems to have had a huge ripple effect on everything that came after.
Oh, yeah. Vladimir the Great's conversion to Orthodox Christianity.
In 988.
Yeah, that was a game changer.
And it wasn't just like a personal religious experience, right?
No, not at all. It had this enormous cultural and political impact on Russia.
So how did that one decision shape things so much?
Well, first of all, it aligned Russia with the Byzantine Empire.
Okay.
And with Orthodoxy rather than with Rome and Catholicism.
So it set them on a completely different path than Western Europe.
Exactly. And that influenced everything from their alphabet and art to their ideas about the role of the ruler.
So it wasn't just about religion, it was about creating a whole different cultural identity.
Precisely. And that division between East and West has really echoed throughout Russian history.
Okay, so we've got this kind of emerging power in Kievan Rus. They've got their own distinct culture, and then bam.
The Mongols.
The Mongol invasion in the 13th century.
Yeah, it was devastating.
This wasn't just a minor setback. It sounds like a total upheaval.
Oh, absolutely. The Mongol Golden Horde, they ruled over Russian lands for over 2 centuries.
2 centuries, wow.
It's often called the Tatar yoke. And it basically cut Russia off from a lot of what was happening in Europe.
So while Europe was going through the Renaissance, Russia was under Mongol rule.
Exactly. And that isolation, it had a lasting impact on their political and social development.
So you could argue that this contributed to Russia's tendency towards strong centralized leadership later on.
It's definitely one interpretation you could make.
So how do we get from this period of Mongol dominance to the rise of Moscow?
Well, Moscow was strategically located a bit further north, a bit more protected from some of those later Mongol raids.
Okay, so it had a bit more stability.
Yeah. And the early Muscovite princes, they were actually pretty clever.
In what way?
They figured out how to work with the Mongols.
To their own advantage.
Exactly. And they gradually accumulated more and more power.
Until
we get to Ivan III in the late 1400s.
Ivan the Great.
Yeah. He was the one who finally threw off the Mongol yoke.
And that was the real beginning of a unified Russian state.
It was a defining moment, setting the stage for everything that followed.
And what followed was his grandson, Ivan I.
Ah, yes, Ivan the Terrible.
The Terrible.
Yeah, he became the first Tsar of Russia.
And he was known for both expanding Russia's territory.
Through some pretty brutal military campaigns.
And also
being absolutely ruthless within Russia itself.
So was there a connection between those two things?
It's a complicated picture, but you could argue that his brutality at home was part of how he consolidated his power.
To then expand outward.
Exactly. He needed to eliminate any potential rivals, and he did that through some pretty terrifying methods.
Like what?
Well, he created this thing called the Oprichnina.
What was that?
Basically, it was like a state within a state with its own army and its own laws, and they were loyal only to Ivan.
And they carried out these horrific purges.
Against anyone he perceived as a threat.
So he was basically creating a climate of fear.
Absolutely. And it worked. He maintained control, but at a terrible cost.
Mm-hmm. And after Ivan the Terrible died, Russia went through this period called the Time of Troubles.
Yeah, it was chaos. Pure chaos.
Like, what was going on?
Well, there was no clear heir to the throne, so there were all these power struggles.
Okay.
Plus, there were famines, peasant uprisings, foreign armies invading.
It sounds like the whole country was on the verge of collapse.
It really was. And it shows just how fragile the Russian state still was at that point.
So how did they get out of that mess?
Well, eventually in 1613, the Romanov dynasty came to power.
Okay.
And they managed to restore some order and stability.
So it was like hitting the reset button.
In a way, but the memory of that chaos, it definitely lingered.
And the Romanovs, they ruled for a really long time.
Over 300 years, yeah.
And the Echoes of Russia podcast focuses on one Romanov in particular, Peter the Great.
Yeah, he was a real game changer.
What made him so different?
Well, he realized that Russia was lagging behind Western Europe.
And in what way?
In terms of technology, military power, just overall development. Yeah. So he embarked on this massive program of modernization.
Like what kind of things did he do?
Oh, he reformed the army, built a navy, reorganized the government.
Wow.
Promoted education and science. And of course, he built St. Petersburg.
Oh, right. As a new capital city.
Yeah, a symbol of Russia's turn towards the West.
It was like he was dragging Russia into the modern world.
Kicking, screaming sometimes, but yeah, he transformed the country.
And then we get to Catherine the Great in the 18th century.
Another powerful ruler.
And she continued this trend of modernization and expansion.
Absolutely. She gained a lot of new territory for Russia.
Right.
Mostly in the south and west.
Okay.
And she also really cultivated Russia's image as a major European power.
So by the end of the 18th century, Russia was a force to be reckoned with.
Oh, yeah, they were a major player on the world stage.
But the 19th century brought new challenges, right?
Definitely the Crimean War was a big wake-up call.
What happened?
Russia went up against Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire. They lost badly. It showed just how far behind they were militarily.
So it exposed their weaknesses.
Exactly. And that led to a lot of internal unrest.
People were demanding change.
Yeah, there were calls for reform, and the most significant one was probably the abolition of serfdom.
Oh, right. That was under Tsar Alexander II in 1861.
It was a huge deal. Millions of peasants were finally freed from being tied to the land.
But it wasn't a perfect solution, was it?
No, it wasn't. It gave them freedom, but not necessarily economic equality.
So there were still underlying problems.
Definitely. And those problems continued to simmer throughout the rest of the century.
And then World War I came along and just threw everything into chaos.
It was a disaster for Russia. Millions of casualties, economic collapse.
And it completely undermined the Tsar's authority.
Exactly. It created the perfect conditions for a revolution.
And that's what happened in 1917.
The Russian Revolution.
The Tsar was overthrown.
And the Bolsheviks took power, led by Vladimir Lenin.
It was a radical change.
It was a complete upheaval of the old order.
And it led to the creation of the Soviet Union.
In 1922.
So how did that happen? Why did the Bolsheviks succeed?
Well, the Echoes of Russia podcast emphasizes a couple of things.
Okay.
First, the provisional government that replaced the Tsar. They failed to address the real problems.
Which were
the economy, land reform.
So people were desperate for solutions.
And the Bolsheviks, they promised radical change.
And they delivered.
In a way, yeah. They ended the war, they redistributed land, they nationalized industry.
But it came at a price, right?
A huge price.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Civil War was incredibly brutal.
And then after Lenin died,
Stalin came to power.
And that's when things got really dark.
Yeah, Stalin's reign was a time of both incredible progress and incredible horror.
In what way?
Well, he pushed for rapid industrialization.
Okay.
And he collectivized agriculture.
Which meant?
Taking land away from private farmers and creating these giant state-run farms.
So it was a complete transformation of the economy.
It was, but it was incredibly brutal. Millions died from famine and forced labor.
And then there were the purges.
Yeah, Stalin was paranoid about anyone who might oppose him.
So
he had millions of people arrested, executed, or sent to gulags.
It's a truly horrific chapter in history.
It's a stark reminder of the dangers of totalitarian power.
So the Soviet Union emerges from World War II as a superpower.
Right alongside the United States.
And that sets the stage for the Cold War.
Decades of tension and rivalry.
So how did this global struggle shape life inside the Soviet Union?
Well, it created this constant sense of being under threat.
From the
West, from capitalism, from NATO.
So there's a lot of propaganda.
Oh, yeah. Tons of it about the evils of the West and the superiority of the Soviet system.
And there was an arms race?
Both sides building up their nuclear arsenals.
It's kind of terrifying to think about.
It was a scary time for everyone involved.
And then there was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
In 1979.
That was a disaster, wasn't it?
It was a costly war, both in terms of lives and resources.
And it further weakened the Soviet economy.
Definitely, it was one of the factors that contributed to the eventual collapse.
Because the Soviet Union did collapse in 1991.
It did. It all happened pretty quickly in the end.
So what were the main reasons for that collapse?
Well, the Echoes of Russia podcast points to a few things.
Okay.
Decades of economic stagnation.
The system just wasn't working anymore.
Right. And then Gorbachev's reforms.
Perestroika and glasnost?
Yeah. They were meant to fix things, but they actually ended up accelerating the collapse.
How so?
Well, glasnost opened up the system, allowed for more freedom of speech, and that led to a lot of criticism of the government.
And perestroika.
It was supposed to restructure the economy, but it caused a lot of chaos and disruption.
So it was like a perfect storm.
It was, and the Soviet Union just couldn't withstand it.
And that brings us to modern Russia.
Starting with independence under Boris Yeltsin.
And the 1990s were a really tough time for Russia, weren't they?
They were a period of economic crisis, political instability.
The transition from communism to capitalism was really rough.
It was, for a lot of people, it meant poverty, unemployment, loss of security.
And then Vladimir Putin came to power in 2000.
And he brought a certain level of stability.
But also
increased authoritarianism, crackdowns on dissent.
A more assertive foreign policy.
Yeah, Putin's Russia has been increasingly willing to flex its muscles on the world stage.
And that leads us to the conflicts in Chechnya and Georgia.
And ultimately to the war in Ukraine.
In 2022. That's been a major turning point.
It's had a huge impact on Russia's relationship with the rest of the world.
And it's created all sorts of new challenges.
So where does that leave Russia in 2025, according to this Echoes of Russia podcast?
Facing an uncertain future with a lot of economic and political problems.
And a lot of big questions to answer.
About its place in the world.
Wow, so that was a whirlwind tour through Russian history.
I know, right? 1,000 years in like an hour.
But it's amazing to see these big themes that run through it all. The struggle for power, the constant change, the back and forth between reform and repression.
And the enduring influence of geography and history.
It all shapes who they are today.
So given everything we just talked about, what do you think are the biggest forces that will shape Russia's future?
Well, the Echoes of Russia podcast ends in 2025, so we're kind of left hanging.
True, but based on what we've learned...
I think it comes down to a few key things.
Okay.
First, how will they manage their economy?
Which has been hit hard by sanctions.
Exactly. And then there's the political situation.
Will there be more openness or more repression?
It's hard to say.
And then there's the whole global landscape?
With new technologies emerging.
Yeah.
New power dynamics shifting.
So how Russia adapts to all of that will determine its fate.
I think so.
And the weight of their history, all those past triumphs and tragedies.
It's all going to play a role.
It's a lot to think about.
It is. It's a complex and fascinating story.
And it's not over yet.
Not by a long shot.
So to our listeners out there, what do you think? What are your predictions for Russia's future?
Leave a comment. Let us know your thoughts.
We'd love to hear them.
We'll see you next time.
For another deep dive
into history.
See you then.
Bye.